On New Game Plus, we'd like to keep a little bit of a lighter, more jovial atmosphere, but sometimes things get a little bit serious, and it's time for us to do a bit of a serious business series about, I guess, internet matters. Is that probably the easiest way to describe it?
Yes, well, the internet's where we do our gaming, it's where we live our lives, we socialise, and the internet is a very important issue to gamers, and everyone watches this show. So what we're doing is we're having a look at internet issues that affect us all. The first one we're looking at as part of this series is metadata.
So metadata, obviously, it's a big buzzword at the moment. It's huge in the Australian sphere. Everybody's talking about the new laws being pushed through. But, I mean, in the simple definition is it's data about data. But I think that's a real underestimation of what metadata actually is.
Oh, it is, yes. Metadata is every call you make, who you make the call to. It's when you're home, when you're out. It's all your coordinates sent from your phone. It's who you send email to. It's the websites you visit, the internet searches you make. It is the ultimate stalker. The metadata is every single thing you do. It's a stalker.
Well, it's interesting to note that it's basically... it's not necessarily the content, it's just where it was sent from, who it was sent to, that kind of thing. And I think that's probably the important distinction, because people assume that it's not as malicious. And that was why we interviewed Scott Ludlam about that particular topic.
Yes, we asked him a lot of questions about metadata. First up, the government has said that it's to stop terrorism. We've had terrorist raids already. The Australian Federal Police have been very effective with it. So I asked Scott, well, what's the problem with the current system?
I think the current laws that we have for safeguarding metadata from intrusion by hundreds of different agencies are really inadequate. So I don't think it's the case, as the government would put it, that we've got a system that's robust, that doesn't need much changing, that we're just kind of adding on this requirement to store material for longer. The existing authorisation regime for lawful access to Australians' private information is deeply broken. There were well over 500,000 applications, and these don't go to a judge, they're not targeted or discriminate. It's a piece of paper that gets filled out, and the agency gives it straight to iiNet or Telstra or whoever it is, and then they hand the material over. The system that we have at the moment is deeply flawed. What effectively I think has happened is technology has simply overrun the law. There's nothing intrinsically bad about metadata. I mean, any communications tool or service will generate it. The question is, how long does it hang around for? How well protected is it? And how easy is it for people to get a hold of, either for legitimate purposes or for illegitimate purposes?
Now, this is serious data being stored. And one of the things I was personally worried about is, can I check the data is correct? Because it's used for serious business. Now, I can check my credit data, my credit report. So are there any options to check my metadata?
The Fairfax journalist at the moment, Ben Grubb, who is trying to get hold of his own metadata, and he's being told too hard, too expensive, forget it, that's, it's now lawyers at 50 paces, when hundreds of other agencies can get a hold of it just by filling out a 2-page form and rubber stamping it. He can't get hold of his own.
And that includes agencies like Centrelink. So basically ones that you wouldn't imagine have anything to do with terrorism.
I think selling it, as the government has tried to do, as a national security measure is really deeply misleading. The security agencies already have access to metadata. They can already get it on a warrantless basis. They don't have to report how much of it they get or collect. They don't have to destroy it after they've got a hold of it. And they can use these things called data preservation notices, which is effectively targeted discriminate data retention for persons of interest. And I've actually got no particular problem with that. I think the process could be a bit more robust, but I think the power is appropriate. But I think there are a multitude of other agendas that are being carried along under this cloak of national security. And the term national security is really meant to tell Labor that they're not allowed to oppose it. It's meant to tell the opposition not to be in opposition. And there's this whole range of other agendas being dragged along behind it. Centrelink is a very large user of warrantless metadata access. And the copyright industry, the rights holders, I think that's another one where the government doesn't want to talk about it, but that is actually, I think, a really important part of the agenda.
Now, I guess the other concerning side of it as well is that the Australian Federal Police Commissioner, Andrew Colvin, has come out and said that they could use this data to police illegal, like downloading, basically piracy.
Like Game of Thrones.
Well, Game of Thrones, basically. Yeah. And I think that's the thing. Will a lot of Australians respond positively to the idea of this data being used to track something which is effectively not a criminal matter?
I don't think that these laws would make us safer. I even think the national security argument is flawed. It's not that Western European countries suddenly became less safe or more vulnerable to terrorism when data retention laws were struck out by the European Court of Justice. It didn't make them less safe. Countries that don't have indiscriminate data collection on every citizen are not at greater risk, so it doesn't make people safer. But I think it was important that the police commissioner let that cat out of the bag, and yes, the minister squashed him and tried to obfuscate and change the subject. This is the same government that's proposing to sign us up to the Trans-Pacific Partnership that could actually invoke criminal penalties for file sharing. They probably have copyright enforcement draft laws in the bottom drawer waiting for an appropriate time to bring that in. They've been hinting at that for more than a year. And as has been written up in the press recently, even if the police aren't prosecuting you for file sharing, the rights holders, the companies themselves, can subpoena your records. And the government is now going to be forcing ISPs to hold a lot more of your records and your private information. So it's a bit disingenuous to then stand back and say, oh no, the government won't be coming after you, when in fact what they will be doing is opening the door for private corporations to come after you.
Now, all this data is going to be stored in the cloud, and we know the cloud's been very, the PlayStation Network hack, there was another famous one, the celebrity photos.
That was huge, It is one every other couple of weeks you hear about that's, change your passwords, even Dropbox, things like that have been
there's so many internet people chasing this data. Now, this data is going to be sitting on a server somewhere. Can that safety of that data be guaranteed?
Industry is saying that that bulk collection of metadata and storage of material that the companies don't want or need will be a honeypot, is the word that they're using, as you're creating these extremely valuable archives that can be matched up and paint very complete pictures of people's private lives. And so where will it be stored? Well, IONET told a recent forum in Parliament, and they weren't necessarily speaking for themselves because they're quite a big player, but that will, the increased cost pressure of having to store all this material that they don't want, it's likely to drive some of the smaller players into Chinese cloud providers, where you have very little guarantee at all of safety and integrity of that information, and how would you enforce it? And again, to keep coming back to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, it may well be illegal to discriminate. It may well be that the government is reducing a tool that it might otherwise have had, to say you have to host this material in Australia and it has to be subject to certain privacy provisions. The Trans-Pacific Partnership may well make that kind of behaviour unlawful.
Well, if it appears in US servers, isn't it a fair game for the NSA? Don't they have that requirement that anything goes through their servers as theirs, basically?
I think since the United States government passed the Patriot Act, we should assume that any material hosted on US servers is compromised. And they are building, the US NSA is building this enormous data centre in Utah effectively to try and capture and store and back up everything. Not the full take of the entire internet, of course, because I'm still not sure that technology exists, but certainly trying to swallow as much of the open pipe as possible and record as much of it as they can. So whether Australian providers would end up outsourcing data collection from metadata snooping to the US, that's an open question. It's entirely possible.
Now, this is serious data that's being stored, and it's being stored somewhere in the cloud.
Yeah.
So one of my concerns is, how do we know if there has been a breach, if it has been hacked into or stolen by somebody? Because I'd like to take measures to protect myself if that does happen. So I did ask Scott then, what facilities are there to let me know if my data is out in the wild?
Well, there were two pieces of legislation, or two proposals, that were live in the last Parliament that have just completely come off the table since last September's election. One of them was mandatory data breach notification, where, like Sony, in one of the examples you cited before, if they lose a large amount of personal information to hackers, they are actually obliged by law to advise their user base as rapidly as possible and not faff around trying to clean it up quietly behind the scenes, but actually let people know. And the second one was the tort of privacy, which effectively gives you a right above a certain threshold of invasion of privacy to sue in the Australian courts. So neither of those things exist at the moment. And so this is where we've got to realise that data retention isn't just for you and me, and it isn't just for Osama bin Laden. It's for High Court judges, diplomats, police officers, people in witness protection programs, people fleeing domestic violence, people with mental or sexual health issues. It's everybody. And different people will feel different degrees of vulnerability about that. If you're a government whistleblower and you were carrying a mobile phone, if you're an investigative journalist, if you're a climate change activist planning on locking onto a coal loader, there are a whole variety of, I would say, entirely legitimate reasons why people might want to keep their movements and their private communications and their social networks very much to themselves.
Now, this is going to be no small task. I think this is the big thing to consider. Joe Hockey said we have no money left in the budget, in the recent budget. There's cuts to basically everything. How are we going to pay for this? It's going to have to come from somewhere. IONET have estimated it's going to cost $600 million. I guess the big question is, where does that come from?
The money for data retention is going to come out of your pocket, whether you use the internet or not. And the reason people have started referring to it as a surveillance tax is that it either comes out of taxpayers' pocket or it comes in higher data charges from your service provider that they're forced to pass on to their customers. I think what's going to happen is both. The $600 million estimate that IONET came with, that was industry-wide, it was for a year and included the setup costs. I think we should treat with a grain of salt. They acknowledged at the time that when they were making that estimate, $600 million or thereabouts, they actually didn't know what it was that the government wanted, because the government, despite the Attorney General's Department pursuing data retention for at least 6 years, has never actually tabled a formal definition of what they want industry to store. So at the time that IONET was making those estimates, they said wide range of variability here because the government still won't tell us what they're going to force us to store. So we should look for those estimates, I suspect, to change. They may go up, they may go down. Interestingly enough, the government a couple of weeks ago engaged PricewaterhouseCoopers to undertake an independent study of costs, and yet they've introduced the legislation before that study has been done. And what that tells us is that the government couldn't care less how much it costs. They don't care. If they cared, the Attorney General's Department would have had it costed 6 years ago when they first started these discussions with industry. So it's going to cost us, and the costs, I imagine, will be difficult to estimate because the cost of data storage is falling very quickly at the same time as the volumes of data generated is going through the roof. And I think the cost estimates will be very sensitive to, is it a big ISP? Is it a small one? Is it something like Telstra that already probably has the catchment systems and kind of data matching systems in place? You know, you're not hearing a lot about how much it's going to cost Telstra. They might find that it doesn't cost them a huge amount to upgrade. But what I think data retention will do is drive even further consolidation in the telco sector, because it's the small guys who are going to find it hardest. They're going to be the ones going to offshore hosting providers that won't have good guarantees of data security. That's going to count against them. And for their own systems, they're going to find they're having to upgrade their own bespoke systems, and that's going to be costly as well. I suspect one of the reasons that we haven't heard much from Telstra or Optus is that they know it's going to advantage the big end of town, which is another thing that this government seems to be very good at. But it's going to cost us all, both from the tax base and from, I would suspect, higher data charges.
Now, we've also got the NBN as... Well, it's not going to reach the peak speeds that we originally promised.
It's definitely not going to be the same infrastructure, the same speeds.
It's a shadow of what we were promised. Now, combined with the costs and the effort for data retention, I did ask Scott, does that make Australian business, and especially IT businesses, does it make it really hard to compete against other countries?
I think this government should stand absolutely condemned for what they've done to the National Broadband Network, which was a project that was in a bit of trouble, and it needed somebody to come in and clean out the subcontracting arrangements, get the project back on track. It wasn't over budget, and don't believe anyone who tells you that, but it was running well behind. And who better than Malcolm Turnbull to have given it a bit of a shakeout and then set it on the course to complete the project, and instead they've shattered it, and now the project is basically on its knees. So you lose that sense of a universal fast fibre service to every premise at the same time as they want to turn it into a surveillance panopticon. I hope it costs them government in 2 years' time.
Well, I guess the other thing with the NBN, not reaching those speeds that it was originally said, was community television also is threatened with the idea of going onto the internet. So I guess the question being there is what's Scott's reaction to that? Like, how does he feel about that transition being made, I guess, against C31's will?
They're telling community broadcasters to go and play on the internet that we've just broken. Can you imagine if they'd gone to Kerry Stokes and said, mate, Channel 7's going to lose its spectrum, but have you checked out YouTube? It's amazing. You should go and play there.
Yeah.
It's abuse. It's really pretty abusive.
Now, the other thing as well is the last time an internet filter was brought before Parliament under Labor, not only did it have a lot of community disapproval, but a lot of the mainstream media really sold the message that it was not an appropriate use of money, time, whatever. That opinion seems to have waned a little bit. So I guess the question is, if the community is concerned about it, is there something they can do to register their objection to the legislation?
I think the Murdoch press here and overseas tends to reflexively fall in behind the surveillance state. The Murdoch press is firmly in the corner of the kind of soft authoritarianism that we see creeping through the United States, the UK and here. And so it's no surprise the same News Corp papers that are likely to back data retention are the same ones who back the invasion of Iraq and the ASIO laws, even though it'll have a direct impact on their own working journalists. The bigger problem, I guess, because we can win this without the tabloids, believe me, we'll win it despite them. The bigger problem, and the thing that distinguishes the data retention campaign from how we won the filter, is that the filter had a couple of quite small, hardline religious organisations behind it, but really not much else. It didn't have a lot of, institutional momentum or other voices pushing for it. In fact, nobody could work out whose idea it was or who wanted it.
Yeah.
Data retention is different. We need to understand that. It's got the backing of the Attorney General's Department, it's got the backing of the police and security agencies. It's probably being driven in large part out of the United States as part of our Five Eyes obligations. And that's what will make it hard to beat. The fact that the government's got a lot of, the proposal's got a lot behind it. And that's, I think we should still learn from how the campaign to stop the filter was effective, where it worked, where it was a bit scrappy. It wasn't coordinated, there was no manifesto, there was no central organising committee. It was a bit of an insurgency, and I think we can learn a bit from that. Look, I'm strongly of the view that it can be beaten, even though it does have a lot of institutional momentum behind it. And the way that the filter was beaten, despite the moral pressure that was being applied by Labor ministers, was that we knew a couple of important things. We knew that the Labor Party was internally very divided, and many of them really hated it. We knew that the Liberal Party in opposition were divided, and that many of them really hated it. And that meant that Conroy didn't necessarily have the numbers that he needed to pass it through the Parliament. And it's just been a case of the opposition reading the changing winds of politics and saying, the government's at risk on this, we could get behind this one, this is safe. What we are, I think, trying to do as a movement is make it safe for the Labor Party to stand up and behave like an opposition in a way that obviously they didn't feel safe to do on the ASIO bill, and now they're all writing open letters and apologising and saying maybe we should fix it. We want to make sure that it's safe for the Labor Party to behave like an opposition, stand up really strong, black and white, and say no, we're not going to do this. Let's look at other ways that these agencies can get what they need.
So they need to know that they've got the support, that they're not going to get punished come election time, basically.
That's right. And again, I think during the filter, what you saw was not only were the Libs not punished, but the filter was put to bed well before an election. It was abandoned so that the Labor government could get on, as we were all hoping it would do, and sell the NBN, sell positive elements of policy.
Well, everybody wanted that.
Everybody wanted it, and yet it's still been smashed up. And so I think the technical community and the online community more broadly is still finding its voice. And maybe it's risky to even talk about a single community. It's like a network of villages, and some of them don't even talk to each other very much. But the fact is, this is the most powerful communications tool in human history. It's one of the most powerful things that we have ever created, and it's developing into a global civil society where, as you said, you can talk to people on the other side of the world that we may never meet. They can take a photo out their window and they're in Gaza, and there's munitions going off up the end of the street, or people confronting the Ebola catastrophe, or people making cat gifts in Tokyo. We've never had anything as powerful as that, and that's why my instinct is that we use the power of the medium to protect itself, and that's what is being done around the world by dissidents and activists who are pushing back against NSA surveillance or censorship in Iran, or There are ways that we can use these tools to defend the integrity of the medium itself. And that's what we've got to work out what to do here. And ultimately, because it's a parliamentary bill and it's a debate that's happening partly in the field of electoral politics, it means, unfortunately and regrettably, it's a numbers game. If we can find 38 votes, then it's dead. And so we have 10 votes in the Greens. I think we probably have 3 crossbench votes, so that's 13. So we need 25. And 25 is, by wonderful coincidence, exactly the number of Labor senators who didn't show up for the fight over the ASIO bill, who we now need to step up on data retention.
So they can repay us now?
They could maybe make up some of the ground that they lost in the public debate, and I think in the eyes of the community, and certainly in the eyes of some of the media and perhaps themselves, and vote against data retention.